So if you don't want to hear the cold, ugly truth about what we're going to talk about, then now's the time to leave. I assume nobody's going to leave. So that we can get started. Good. A little about me first. I guess I just give you a quick bio. For those of you who aren't familiar, I am a blogger. My parents are very proud, as you can imagine. Why are you laughing? But all moms and dads dream of the day that their kids will go off and become bloggers. That's. I hope my own son gets into the family business one day. I'm already teaching him about, search engine optimization skills and that sort of thing. But in my case, I started writing my opinions online 2 or 3 years ago, and then at a certain point, people fell under the delusion that my opinions matter, and next thing you know, here I am. So that's a very long story short. So here's what we should understand first about abortion. No real segue there, unfortunately, but we're just going to jump into it. Abortion is, first of all, not an issue. It's not just a political issue. You go on a candidate's website, their campaign website, and they'll list all of the issues, and maybe they'll have abortion on there. A lot of times they don't. But if they do, they have it, pretty far down on the page, tucked in between 2 different policy questions. But that's not what abortion is. It's not just an issue. It's quite simply modern humanity's greatest sin. It's a cancer in the bloodstream of American society. It is a travesty of historic proportions, and one that should be garnering an enormous amount of our time, our energy, our resources, our anger. There should be anger when it comes to this. It's not a virtue to not be angry about something like this. That's a vice. And the pro-life movement faces enormous odds, especially now. It's up against not only the evil of the abortion industry, but the suffocating indifference of our self-absorbed society. And this has been illustrated recently with the Planned Parenthood undercover videos, videos that I'm sure we've all seen. If the media had anything to do with it, then you wouldn't have seen them, but videos that, while horrifying and urgent, also didn't really prove anything that we didn't already know. We already knew that Planned Parenthood was murdering innocent lives. We already knew, if we stopped to think about it, that this is a brutal and inhumane practice. Maybe we didn't stop to, maybe we didn't realize that they were selling the baby parts, but if they weren't selling them, then they'd be dumping them in a medical waste container out back. It's not really better, Either way, it's a terrible thing. But what the videos did is they put the reality of abortion out in the open. And they said, okay, here you go, everybody. This is what abortion is. Take a look at this. Are you okay with it? And millions of Americans answered that question and said, sure. So through willful ignorance or apathy or plain old indifference to the plight of dying children, millions of Americans have chosen, even now, with all we've found out, to forsake these children and carry on with their lives. And because of that, we are a country that fails in its most basic and fundamental duty, which is to protect and love our children. We are a country that fails to stand as one, unified in the name of life and liberty. We fail. We fail to even notice that the ground underneath us is soaked in the blood of our children. We are a country that fails. We're a failure as a nation. And we will continue to be so as long as the wholesale slaughter of the young continues, and we're powerless to stop it. This is how serious it is. This is how serious abortion is. Abortion is the central crisis in our civilization, and I call it that not only because of the millions of lives lost, but because it unravels the fabric of our civilization. It subverts the sacred institution of the family and turns children into the prey of their own mothers. So abortion has not just destroyed so many millions. I don't know why I can't keep my glasses up. This is like Does this distract you guys? This really distracted me, to be honest with you. Can I do this without my glasses? We'll try. This will be my first time. Witnessing a miracle. So abortion hasn't just destroyed so many millions of lives, it tries to destroy motherhood itself. And this is why abortion is ground zero of the culture war. Because pro-aborts are trying at an elemental level to take the family, which is that life-giving and life-affirming bond between parent and child, and turn it against itself, implode it from something life-giving to life-taking. From what the family should be, which is a tree rooted in rich soil, bearing fruit for many generations, to an endless whole that consumes and erases. And it's worse even than that, because these women are told that this death and destruction empowers them. And worse even than that, they're told that it's not really death and destruction, at least not permanently. You know, one thing I've noticed about the rationale behind abortion is that often these women believe, if you talk to them, and in fact they're told by the abortion clinics, but they believe that you can abort your son or daughter and then later have a new one, which is true, but it's almost like they think they can have the exact same child again. It's not convenient to be a mother right now. We'll do that later. We'll have a redo. And of course, that's not how it works. Because upon conception, motherhood occurs. She's a mother at that moment. That's why conception is so beautiful. Because not only is a life formed, but two other lives are changed. Their very nature is changed in that moment. So she's a mother. And if she gets an abortion, she won't go back to being a childless woman. She will now be the mother of a dead child. And that's not a message she's going to hear from the abortion clinics, because clinics are parasites that feed on delusion and abandonment, loneliness, ignorance, fear. Which is why the pro-life movement should be the thing that shines a light. This is why the pro-life movement should wield really only two weapons: truth and love. Those are our two weapons. And you know, the thing is, I talk about love, I'm accused of being hateful. People say that about me sometimes. That I'm hateful. You're so hateful. Especially when I oppose abortion, they say you're hateful. Maybe you guys get that too sometimes. But the truth is, you know, I do hate abortion. I hate it. From the bottom of my soul, I hate it. I despise it. But I don't hate the women who get abortions. I don't feel hatred for them, and we shouldn't. You know, we should love them, because they're victims here as well. That's why we don't talk about punishing women who get abortions. That's why we don't talk about that. Donald Trump, because he's an ignoramus and a fraud. He talks about that because he says what he thinks the dupes in his fan base want to hear. But he can't even get that right, because he's a shallow, ridiculous man who has never thought deeply about anything in his pampered, extravagant life. What were we talking about? Anyway, the women, right. The women have been lied to, they've been taken advantage of, they've been used, they've been abused, they've been tossed aside, and they're going to have to carry the weight of this decision for the rest of their lives. So anyone who thinks they need to be punished, they've been punished, if it makes you feel better. There's no punishment worse than that. And they're going to be left to that grief and despair by the abortion industry. The abortion industry will break them and then just toss them to the side. So we reach out with healing, we reach out with love, and we end the cycle of violence and guilt that leads to more abortions. Because for women who are contemplating abortion, hatred will not save the child's life. The best thing we can do is hold out a hand and say, don't be afraid. And that's why it's interesting to me, I am going to take you to church a few times as we're talking. I think that we can talk about abortion and you can understand why abortion is evil, even if you're not a Christian. But the fact that Christ exists is relevant to this conversation, relevant to every conversation. So I'm sorry, I can't help myself. So in Luke chapter 1, the angel of the Lord visits Zechariah to tell him that his wife Elizabeth will be giving birth to a child. And a few lines later, which is 6 months in real time, the angel visits Mary with news that she's bearing a child. And I think it's so powerful and relevant that in each of these cases, one of the first things that the angel says to both mothers is, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. That should be our message. Do not be afraid. Which you contrast with the abortion industry's message, which is, be afraid, be very afraid, your life is over, you're screwed, it's over. Because abortion is a product of fear. And all evils are products of fear, but abortion stands apart from other evils in our culture because it is so entirely dark. There's no light or goodness in it at all. Like something straight from the pit of hell is abortion. I have no doubt that if Satan came to earth in physical form, wanted to get a job, could be an abortionist at Planned Parenthood. They'd be very impressed with his resume. Although, of course, recent evidence suggests that he could also run for president and possibly be elected. But no, it's not. I mean, not, just theory, hypothetical. If you peek under the shiny veneer of our progressive modern society, progressive, under all the happy slogans and the catchy hashtags and the rainbow flags, you'll find the corpses of 50 million dead children, decaying, ignored, forgotten by our culture of emasculated narcissists. And what we see there, as gruesome and disgusting as it is not only an indictment on our society, but the very rotting heart of it. Because we call ours the culture of death. And the reason why we call it that is because our culture's dominant ideology, which is liberalism or progressivism or whatever you want to call it, is in the end a death cult. Which is why I've long suggested that we stop calling it liberalism. It's going to get confusing. Start calling it secular Satanism. Because that's truly the most accurate and coherent way to describe it. The very first liberal, his name was Lucifer. And the whole religion and ideology of Satanism / liberalism was born when Satan himself turned from God and said, I will not serve. And that's the dividing line in humanity. Those who will serve and those who won't. That's ultimately the great dividing line between heaven and hell, that's it. And what better or more profound way for humans to reinforce the point that they won't serve than to ritualistically slaughter God's most precious and vulnerable children. So what we have to understand is that abortion evangelists are pro-abortion in principle. Okay, this is not out of some perverted sense of necessity or compassion. They believe, they have faith that the individual is supreme. That there is no power or authority above me, the mighty me. And therefore nothing has the right to impose itself on me. And nothing, here's the thing, not reality, not biology, this is where transgenderism comes from. The claim that even our anatomy cannot impose on us or make a claim on us or tell us what to do, essentially. Not even our own children can claim any right to our lives and our bodies and our love and our time and our money Because I, as the mighty me, in this way of looking at things, in the sole point and purpose of the universe, and the highest thing that I can hope to attain, the whole point of life, is my own enjoyment, convenience, and pleasure, especially sexual pleasure. There is no truth outside of that for the Satanist/liberal. There is no God beyond myself. There is no reality besides the one I make. And the thing is, when you live in a society like this, you'll notice that every other, because we're all gods, okay? Every one of us, living in our own universes. And I can get a little crowded sometimes. But every other mighty me, they can all live in their own bubble of self-gratification and self-worship. And usually it's okay, because if two of the me's happen to bump into one another, you know, it's best if they're polite, simply because it would make them feel good to be polite to each other. And this is why the only Bible verse that many in our culture can cite, there are only 2 Bible verses, and one of them isn't really even a Bible verse, that anyone ever mentions anymore. What's the first one? Don't judge. Which there's context to that, by the way. Jesus wasn't saying never make a judgment call ever. That would be, he would essentially be saying be vegetables every one day. Take your brains out of your head. But the second one, which is a, you know, which is in full context, is very beautiful. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's the other one you hear all the time. Love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, there's truth to that. I mean, Jesus said it. So I endorse it. But our culture takes this to mean that self-love is the highest love, and that we ought to treat others fairly as a matter of pragmatism. It's just sort of a business transaction, that's all. So the love you have for yourself is the starting point. That's the idea. But they miss the whole rest of Scripture, which explains in great detail that we love God above everything and everybody, including ourselves, including our families, including our country, and that through our love for God, we come to truly love ourselves and our neighbors. That's, I think, what Jesus was trying to say. But our satanic culture removes God from that equation, leaving only the self, which cuts off the source and purpose of the love, turning it quickly into indifference and hatred. And that's why you'll notice that the other mighty me's don't always have to be afforded respect or even basic human dignity, because the moment that one of them, it's the only sin you can commit in modern society, the only one, is become a burden somewhere. The moment a person asks another to give or change or serve or love in any kind of active way, is the moment that they transform into a gross parasite, to be extracted and discarded. And the ultimate example of this, of course, is abortion, but not the only example. And the point is driven home when babies are killed and then cut up and used for medical research. And we think nothing of attempting to extend our lives by cannibalizing our children, because after all, I am me. What greater cause could there be than extending my own miserable existence? So when you consider this, it starts to make sense that abortion fans have finally abandoned the safe, legal, and rare mantra. You remember we used to hear that all the time? You don't hear that all the time anymore, do you? Well, you hear about safe and legal, but not so much rare. Nobody cares about rare anymore. In fact, the only people who prattle on about the fantastical rare abortion, the only people who say, well, abortion should happen rarely these days, are moderate conservatives who think that child murder should be totally illegal except for rape or incest, in which case the baby's out of luck. But everyone else has established a more absolutist position. True pro-lifers think that it should never be legal and never be condoned because it's murder. And pro-choicers think it should never be limited or minimized, ever. It makes sense when you think about it. Why should a woman be empowered only rarely? Why should she be permitted to exercise her autonomy in rare circumstances? It doesn't make any sense. If abortion is legal and acceptable because the life of the child is meaningless and the convenience of the mother is sacrosanct, then why in the world should we try to reduce the frequency by which these meaningless things are terminated and carved into pieces for the sake of protecting a more important person's lifestyle? Why should we reduce that? If anything, it should happen more often. It becomes like a sacrament, a celebration of this person's superiority. To try to limit it is nonsensical, even heretical. And this is why progressives don't bother much with arguments about whether the child is human anymore. It's important for us to understand this as pro-lifers, where the pro-abortion movement is headed. Because we've been arguing this case 40 years or more, trying to establish that a human child is human. But now, they might throw it out there as a standard defense, but it's not that essential to their cause. I mean, you'll still hear this, well, it's just a lump of cells argument. But it's an argument that's been debunked and beaten silly a million times over, and pro-aborts know it. After all, I mean, they're aware that lump, I looked up in the dictionary, lump is defined as a compact mass of a substance. And cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. Okay? So babies are lumps of cells. That's true. Just as you are. And actually, if you look at the average Walmart shopper, they're quite a bit lumpier than the average baby. So trying to disqualify a human from the human race based on the grounds that it's a compact substance comprised of cells is like disqualifying cars from a classification as automobiles because they're made of metal and they're on wheels. It doesn't make any sense. You've just defined what the thing is. But most moderately sophisticated liberals, small sample size to be sure, but will not try to seriously pretend that an unborn baby is categorically unhuman. It's absurd. It's always been absurd. We've been arguing this for 40 years. It's absolutely insane. There's no scientific basis for it whatsoever. It's not debatable. In fact, we know that fetus just means offspring. And that's not a species, it's a stage of human development. And it seems rather impossible that a thing could be in a stage of human development, yet not be human. So then they move on to personhood. And they say it's a human but not a person. But can a thing be alive and human but not a person? Is that possible? I mean, they'll say so, but you'll notice that they never actually define the term. How do you define a person in a way that disqualifies the unborn? Aside from just saying, well, a person is a born human. But this is the game they play with virtually every topic, including marriage. They attack the old definition, they get rid of it, but they can't offer a new one in its place. So they'll say that the unborn child from conception lacks the limbs and organs and other physical features necessary to be considered a person. But the problem with that is once it attains those necessary markers, well, then can it then be afforded the rights of all other people? Not according to pro-aborts. Babies at 20 weeks certainly look an awful lot like people. They have most of what they need, according to liberals. Yet they still reject 20-week abortion bans. They base their entire argument on demanding that a baby look like other people before it can be a person, but they won't follow through on their own logic. And if they did, they would oppose most abortions after the first trimester. Likewise, they would support abortions of humans of any age if they are born mutated or get into a car accident, you lose your arm. Sorry, you're not a person anymore. But of course they don't make that argument. Because the fact of the matter is this: either a living human is a person regardless of physical features and development, or we need to petition the government to turn the murder of the severely handicapped and midgets and others into a misdemeanor offense. Personhood is either an absolute state or it's acquired by degrees. But if it's acquired by degrees, that has ramifications outside of the womb, and they're ramifications that are quite horrific. So that's out. They don't have that anymore. And they know. So the pro-abortion movement moves away from that. And now they say whether the unborn entity is a person or a human or a moose or an alien from outer space, it doesn't matter. Abortion is permissible and even laudable purely because the woman wants it. This is their new argument. It's not very new, but you may remember a few months ago there was this online campaign called Shout Your Abortion, where women were using the hashtag Shout Your Abortion on Twitter and bragging about their abortions. And if you peruse that hashtag, which I would recommend that you don't, but if you did, you would see that the arguments that almost all these women were making wasn't, oh, the baby wasn't a person or it wasn't a human or whatever. It was just, hey, I felt like having an abortion, so I did it. It was the best for me, so I did it. I don't care. Person, human, whatever. Abortion is okay because it's what I want to do. That's the new argument. That's not exactly Socrates, but it's convincing logic nowadays. This is what it means to live in a society steeped in relativism. The only moral or legal justification ever needed for anything is, I wanted to do it, so I did. And in terms of the abortion discussion, they do have a more clever way of phrasing this. They have a category for this argument, and they call it bodily autonomy, which I'm sure you guys have heard. My body, my choice, my body is autonomous. So there you go. Doesn't matter what's inside it. Now, to briefly engage this argument, which I think is important because it's their only argument, really. And so this argument was, in fact, I call it new, but it's actually not. It was summed up by a famous hypothetical posed by a woman, Judith Jarvis Thompson, I believe, 40 years ago. And to this day, it's considered sort of the pro-abortion trump card. It is supposedly their unbeatable argument. So let's see about that. And here's the hypothetical, if you haven't heard it. This is the one that she posed for bodily autonomy. She said, you wake up in the morning, find yourself back-to-back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He's been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all of the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known, but still they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him, but never mind, it only takes 9 months. This is how pro-aborts look at pregnancy. The woman is the slave, you see. But rather than being forced into labor by a plantation owner, she has been brutally subjugated by her own baby. And if you gaze into any ultrasound, you will witness not a beautiful and innocent child, but a despotic tyrant, coercing his own. Doesn't mean she's also expected to be a slave, a prostitute, a forced organ donor for talented musical artists. It doesn't work that way. Because parents have a special duty to their own children. It's a very simple concept. See, if I go a lifetime without clothing or feeding or changing your child, I won't face any legal repercussions. If I go 2 days without doing the same for mine, I could end up in prison. Why is that? It's a mystery. In fact, last week, my wife and I, we hired a babysitter. We went out. We rarely do this these days, but we went out and we had a babysitter watch our kids. And we didn't hire a babysitter for all of the children in the world, mind you, but just ours. Only ours. And why is that? Because all the laws everywhere in the world, and all even partially sane human beings everywhere in the world, recognize that you are particularly responsible for and to your own children. And in every other instance, parents are expected, required, forced to do things for their own kids that they aren't forced to do for anyone else. Only in the case of abortion does this principle become controversial. So, number two, an important detail is left out here. How did the violinist become sick in the first place? So in order for this comparison to even come close to holding up, the violinist would have to be sick because the other person caused him to be sick. Just as a woman and a man cause a child to exist. But you have to go even further, because in the scenario of the child, you caused the situation and you already donated the organ, so to speak, the moment he was conceived. So pro-abortion people are fond of comparing pregnancy to organ donation. They do it all the time. But that brings up the question, can you donate an organ to somebody and then take it back? Is that legal? I don't think pregnancy is akin to donating organs to your child, but if it is, the child was donated the organs when the woman became pregnant. And if she can change her mind and withdraw the offer after the fact, shouldn't we allow any organ donor to do the same? You donate an organ, you can go back 20 years to some. Go back, 20 years later, go back to the guy and say, I'm sorry, I'm going to need that back. Number three, abortion is not the same as unplugging a person from medical equipment. It's another important point. It might be really sanitary and nice to refer to abortion as a woman withdrawing support from her child, but the procedure goes beyond that. During a termination, the baby is actively killed. It is crushed, dismembered, poisoned, torn apart. It is killed actively, on purpose. So again, the real analogy would be not withdrawing the wires from the violinist, but shooting him in the head. Those are two different things. 4, you have natural order. An unborn child is exactly where he is supposed to be. He couldn't possibly be anywhere else. This is the inherent distinction between two people hooked up to machines on a hospital bed and a fetus connected to his mother inside her womb. The former represents something unnatural and extraordinary, while the latter is natural and ordinary. The unborn child is where nature, or God as I like to call him, intends him to be. And 5, one more slight technical difficulty here, bodily autonomy does not exist. Our bodies are not autonomous. If they were, if our bodies could never be used without our consent, why would this apply only to pregnancy and organ donations? Because children at any age create profound demands on their parents' bodies. Profound. Waking up in the middle of the night for the crying baby, working long hours to pay for their food and clothing, carrying them around when they can't walk, staying home when you like to go out, going out when you like to stay home, so on and so forth. An argument for absolute bodily autonomy means that it can't be illegal or considered immoral even for a parent to decline to do any of these things. so long as their decision was made in the name of bodily autonomy. Your kid doesn't have any food, and you don't feel like going to the grocery store, you should be able to say, look, I'm feeling rather autonomous today, and sorry, Junior. Take breastfeeding, for example. Child requires milk from his mother in order to survive, right? If she can't, or doesn't wish to provide it, then legally she is required by law to find and pay for a substitute. She must. She is not permitted to let her baby starve to death, or to just cut to the chase and abort him outright. Somehow she has to make sure that he is fed, or she'll go to jail. And even feeding the child formula is an enormous strain on the body, the bank account, very expensive. You have to physically go to the store, purchase it, come home, wake up at all hours of the night. So if your body's autonomous, then you shouldn't have to do that either. All of this constitutes a claim not just on your body, but on your very life. As a parent, existence itself is not autonomous. Your body is no longer your own, your money is no longer your own, especially your money. Your house is no longer your own, your food, your free time, everything. Even the television isn't autonomous anymore. So you get up on a Saturday morning, you want to put on ESPN, and the kid's got, the Wiggles on or some crap like that. And it's just, because everything, everything. They get everything. So all arguments fall apart. And we're back to the simplest one, which is just relativism. Rather than arguing about what is objectively right or good or true, progressives ultimately, their fallback option, and what I think they've really settled on now, is to say that there is no objective truth. What is true for me is true. What's good for me is good. Might not be good for you, it might not be good for the baby that I'm killing, but it's good for me, so it's good. Relativism is both the way progressives justify abortion and also what they get from it. If they can establish that abortion is an acceptable institution, which they have, of course, then they've established their very own universe, their own reality. If our culture is right about abortion, if it's right, then it's right about everything else. If it's right about abortion, then the value of human life is relative to how desirable that life is to those around it. And if human life is relative, then the ideas at the root of our country, inalienable rights, dignities endowed by the Creator, so on and so forth, none of that can be objectively true. God himself cannot be true if life itself is relative. If we can determine the worthiness of human life, then we are God's and truth is whatever we say it is. And for this reason, our society has established abortion as its platform for its campaign against truth, God, and reason. Abortion sets the stage for every other cultural battle. Every other one. This is what makes abortion the defining issue in our society. The number one defining issue. Because it gets right down to the fundamentals of who you are, what you believe. It plants you firmly on the side of objective truth and human dignity, or firmly against it. Everything, whatever else you believe, will grow from this root. So it is the epicenter of America's vast ideological divide, and the most important theater in the culture war. On the other side, for conservatives, or whatever you call us these days, being pro-life is, apart from a mere argument or cause, it's a purpose. It informs, directs, gives substance to every other argument we make about every other subject. People always accuse me, they say everything comes back to abortion for you. You bring abortion to everything. And that's true. It all comes back to abortion, because if human life has no intrinsic value, then none of this other stuff matters. None of it. Not taxes, not gun rights, not immigration. None of it matters if we cannot first establish that life matters. It boggles my mind that anyone could say, well, let's not worry about that, let's talk about our guns, or whatever. And those are all good subjects. But how can you pass right over the life part? How can you pass over establishing whether we even have a right to be here in the first place? This is why I'm always frustrated by conservatives who say, well, let's leave the social issues alone. Just talk about jobs and the economy, right? So we're willing to see that babies can be carved to pieces and sold a la carte like a turkey at the deli, yet we think we can then move on and win the argument on the economy. But why does the economy matter if we haven't actually reached a consensus that life is meaningful to begin with? You think your economic liberty, your money, your wallet should be respected? If we haven't agreed that your very existence, your very humanity should be respected? Makes no sense. Makes absolutely no sense. No other issue matters if life is not sacred and intrinsically valued. Period. Intrinsic. Another definition, belonging to a thing by its very nature. Okay? This is why we oppose abortion. We know why progressives support it. Because it makes them God. But we oppose it for this very simple reason. Because it destroys innocent human life. And innocent human life has intrinsic value. Simple, logical, consistent. But what about but nothing, buddy? Those buts do not negate the value of the life in question. So you can throw out the most rare, most tragic, most gut-wrenching scenario you like, and it will not change the answer because it doesn't change the question. And again, the question is, does life have intrinsic value? And our answer is yes. And so it must always be yes. In every scenario. This is not hard. And we have to shout that yes. Because it resonates. Because people know that life is sacred. They know it. Everyone knows that life is sacred. Because we're all living, right? We all generally enjoy the fact that we're living. But out of selfishness, spite, laziness, whatever, many of us convince ourselves that we don't know it. That we don't have this recognition that life is valuable. But you know, rarely can a person entirely fool themselves, which leads to one of the great ironies in modern culture, that the pro-abortion side also tends to be the most adamantly pro-environment, pro-animal rights. They weep over the death of a sycamore tree or an African lion, but not over a child. You remember poor Cecil the lion. May he rest in peace. Sorry, it chokes me up thinking about that. No, I mean, he was fine. Like, I'm sure he was a nice guy, but you know, and our society just lost its mind because a lion died. And it seems kind of silly, but there's something good there, you know? Because deep down, even though their priorities are out of whack, they still recognize the life in that tree, in that cat, and they revere it. So our job is to get them to open up their hearts a little wider and see the whole picture. Use that as a starting point if we have to. Our job is to send them down the rabbit hole and ask them really scary questions. Like, okay, you're very sad that a lion or tree or whatever dies. Why? Because it's majestic and beautiful. Okay. Why does that matter? There are other beautiful things. There are like a million other beautiful things. cares about this one? Why do we need these? Who cares if they're exterminated from the face of the earth? Kill every single lion. What does it matter? What does it matter? Because it'll upset the ecosystem. Okay, but who cares about the ecosystem? Why does the ecosystem matter? Because all living organisms depend on it. Yes, that's true, but now we're back to the original question, which is who cares about the living organisms and why? I'm arguing with myself now. This is what I do. You gotta feel bad for my wife. This is what I do at home. And why do we instinctively place some organisms over others? Why do we have this hierarchy in our minds? All of us do. Why aren't you upset? Or why wouldn't you be upset if I crushed a cockroach right now? But if I pulled out a cat and lit it on fire, you'd be upset. Or, I could kick the cat or drown it. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do with cats. I don't like cats, but give this some thought. But what is life? Why does it matter? What makes it valuable? What makes some life more valuable than others? Why is your neighbor more significant than the tree on his front yard? Why do we weep when a life is taken? It's a terrorist attack. 30 people are dead. Why do we care about that? Why do we usually celebrate when a life is born? Why are you here? Why am I here? Why was the lion here? Why is the tree here? Why should any of this be treated with dignity? Why should you be treated with dignity? If you answer these questions, you can come to one of two conclusions. There are only two available. And one is, it's all meaningless and nothing matters, kill everything, who cares? And the second is, life is inherently sacred, especially human life. So you confront these mysteries and you will either end up a suicidal, murderous nihilist or a pro-life zealot. There's no room in between. Despite our feverish desire to find room, there isn't. This is why everything comes back to the pro-life mission, back to us in this room. And I know some of you might not be pro-life, but you should be. Because we pro-lifers have answers to all these questions, don't we? And we're not afraid to answer. Life is sacred. And until we can convince our culture of this, until we can show them this, until we can prove this, there's no hope of making real progress in any other area. We have to defeat the underlying nihilistic premise that says human life has no worth or dignity, or that its worth and dignity can be relative to circumstance. And that's why I'm a big believer, by the way, that although there's nothing wrong with concentrating intently on abortion, it's a very good thing, we cut ourselves off at the knees if we don't extend that argument to every issue. And I don't just mean the obvious ones like euthanasia, stem cell research, etc. Even things like pornography. If abortion is wrong, so is pornography. Why? Because it violates the dignity of a human being. Gay marriage violates the sanctity of the family and of marriage. The whole point is that pro-life is an absolute declaration. It's not something that can be parsed and divided and sectioned off. We are pro-life completely or not at all. And the world, I believe, needs us to be pro-life completely. The world needs us to testify unwaveringly to a simple truth that life has meaning, life has value, life is sacred. That's our entire argument. And it's a really good argument. It's a really good one. Now, time's up, I took my glasses off. Okay. One last note before we wrap up. Now I'm going to get totally religious on you. Ugh, right? You. So there's this this image I have in my mind that I think about sometimes. I go back to it again and again in my head. It's not a vision or anything, it's just a thought that I have. A thought articulated also by men like Fulton Sheen and others. So I often imagine my day of judgment, okay? Have you thought about this? Not my day of judgment, I know. Many people have thought about that with glee in their heart. But your own. So I've thought about it. I imagine waking up naked, surrounded by light. And this light, I would imagine, is brighter than anything that I've seen before, but not blinding. And hotter than anything I've felt, but not burning. And so there I am, I imagine. And there in front of me is him. So I imagine Christ. I imagine standing before Christ on that day, whenever it comes. Could be in 70 years, could be in 2 hours. And I imagine that he towers there above me. He's immense, he's eternal, he's beautiful, he's terrifying. I don't imagine meeting Jesus the way that he's often described in the Christian rock songs. Like he's my buddy and I walk up, hey buddy, what's up? Good to see you. I imagine that I collapse and weep like a child, which is what every single one of us will do, and beg for mercy that we don't deserve. And so I imagine that he speaks in this moment, and I don't dare imagine what he sounds like, but just that he speaks. And his eyes are looking at me, and they're bigger than planets, and his face is like the sun. And he's peering directly at me, and I feel bigger and smaller in this moment than I've ever felt. Bigger because I'm standing there, attracting the complete attention of God himself. The great power of the universe is looking right at me, just as he always has. But I was too stupid to realize it before. But now there's no avoiding it. And I'm attracting the complete attention of God himself. And I imagine that we have a conversation in this moment, but it's rather one-sided. There isn't much I can say or need to say because he's looking at me, through me, into me, seeing my thoughts, passing his judgment. And I don't know what will be said, but I imagine this one question that I feel so sure will be asked of all of us. I imagine that he will look at me, he'll look at you, and he'll ask, what did you do for my little ones? What did you give to them? What did you do to defend and protect my most helpless and vulnerable children? I sent millions of children to earth while you were there. And while you were there, millions were sent back, bloodied and mangled. What did you do about that? And if I've done everything that I could do, then I imagine that there could be a choir of little voices, which would be the aborted children. They're beautiful, they're whole again, and they're crying out that the Lord would take mercy on me. But then I imagine if I've done nothing, if I failed to really try, if I sat back and let it happen, if I cared more about my reputation, my convenience, than loving my Lord's children and striving to help and protect them, how am I going to explain that? I might try to explain it, but it won't matter. And what I imagine I hear in response is silence, a terrible silence. And I can imagine those agonizing, fatal words that Christ promised some of us would hear. We like to pretend he didn't promise this, but he did. Depart from me, I never knew you. Some of us are going to hear that. So despite the fact that I've been asked to come speak to you tonight about this topic, I can't honestly tell you I'm confident that choir of voices will be there for me. I can't honestly tell you I'm confident I'm doing enough. In fact, I can tell you this, I'm not doing enough. I'm simply not doing enough. If we really believe that millions are being murdered on our watch, in our neighborhoods, if we really believe that, do you actually believe that? If we do, then that belief makes a claim on us. It makes demands on us. It becomes a responsibility and a burden. There's a great burden that comes with knowing the truth. You know, William Wilberforce said of the slave trade in 1790, his famous saying, he said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you did not know." Well, we can't say that we didn't know. That excuse will not be available to us. So all that's left is action. So to those of you who are doing all you can, giving all you can, then I applaud you, I admire you, I respect you, I urge you to keep going. But if you can survey your life and say, there's this atrocity going on, but all I've given of myself is silence and apathy and indifference, maybe I've talked a big game. Or maybe I haven't even done that. Maybe I'm too afraid to even talk about it. Maybe I'm uncomfortable right now listening to somebody talk about it. That's how uncomfortable I am. If that describes you, then I say, now's the time to pick up the sword and join the battle. Because there are lives at stake, and there are souls at stake, including yours. There are only two sides in this world. And only one of those sides stands for life and truth. So ask yourself, whose side are you on? All right, thanks, everyone. That's all I got.